Good evening and welcome to everyone. My name is Michelle Abo, and I am a member of the great class of 1978 from Princeton University, and I am currently the Chief Sales Officer of Barry House Coffee, one of New York's premier coffees. Today, we're super honored to have as our speaker, Jeffrey Sussman. Jeffrey is the author of 15 nonfiction books. His most recent titles include Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science, and Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York, all published by Rowman Littlefield. Jeffrey is the president of Jeffrey Sussman Incorporated, a marketing and PR firm. Today, we're going to talk about Holocaust fighters, boxers, resistors, and Avengers. And in this book, and here it is, it's a fascinating read. Jeffrey shares riveting stories of the courageous people who fought back against the Nazis. And specifically, he goes into the lives of 5 boxers who were forced to fight for their lives while imprisoned in concentration camps. It's explored in depth. It's followed by the stories of those who managed to escape captivity and reveal the truth about the death camps. Jeffrey also depicts in detail the acts of the Avengers, a military unit that hunted down and killed Nazi war criminals. And then finally, there's the book talks about the Nuremberg trials and the prosecutors who brought the Nazi leaders to justice. And those folks who, while they were at the camps, they watched the Jewish and Gypsy boxers beat each other for their own personal entertainment. Holocaust Fighters is an incredible account of the many ways that people resisted Nazi rule, providing really moving portrayals of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of incredible horrors. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Jeffrey, first of all, what sparked your interest in writing this book?
Well, I've always been interested in boxing. When I was a young man, my father taught me to box. He had been an amateur boxer, and I was a skinny little kid, and he thought it would be good for my self-defense to learn to box. And he had a good friend growing up named Abe Simon, who boxed for the heavyweight championship against Joe Louis in 1940 and 1941. He lost both times. But anyway, that sparked my interest in boxing. And I was particularly initially interested in the role that Jewish boxers played in boxing, and found out that they dominated the sport from 1910 to 1941. There were a couple of hundred Jewish boxers, and about 24 of them were world champions. And I thought it was interesting that there was a lot of publicity about Joe Louis fighting Max Schmeling in 1939, I believe it was. But there was a little information about Max Baer fighting Max Schmeling in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power. And my father had attended that boxing match at Yankee Stadium in 1933. And he said when Max Baer took off his robe and revealed a Jewish star in his boxing trunks, about half of the 60,000 fans in attendance stood up and cheered. They were mainly poor Jewish people who were looking for a hero. And Max Baer was so incensed at what Hitler wanted to do to the Jews of Germany and other Eastern European countries that he decided to really go after Max Schmeling. And he pummeled him so badly that the referee had to stop the fight. I think it was in the 10th round. And so that caused me to write my first boxing book, which was Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Boxing. And then I wrote books generally about boxing, Boxing and the Mob, a biography of Rocky Graziano, and other books. And in the process, I came across a story about a man named Harry Haft, who had been arrested and sent to Auschwitz, where he was forced to fight 76 times, sometimes twice a week, for the entertainment of the SS guards. And it was a terrible situation for him, because if he didn't fight, he would have been killed. And yet the people that he fought, because if they lost, they were dragged off, probably to the gas chambers or just starved to death, and then eventually incinerated. And when I read about that, I was so taken by that, I decided to do research and to find out about other Jewish boxers. And I came across 4 other Jewish boxers, and then also a gypsy boxer. Gypsy is really a colloquial word. They're really either Sinti or Roma. And I came across this one man named Johann Trollman, who was treated almost as badly as the Jews were treated. And he was forced to also fight for the entertainment of the SS guards in the concentration camps. So altogether, I found 5 people whose lives I found absolutely fascinating, and I decided to research them and then to write about them.
Yes, and we'll get into them in a little bit more detail. One of the things, it's very clear from the book that the Germans, and specifically Hitler, had a tremendous fascination in boxing, and particularly worshiped Max Schmeling, who you were just referencing before. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that and kind of the misnomer about Max Schmeling as actually being a Nazi sympathizer.
Yeah, I mean, in Mein Kampf, Hitler writes about how important boxing is to train Wehrmacht warriors, and in fact, all the boys in Germany were forced to join the Hitler Youth movement, and part of the Hitler Youth movement was to learn to box. And there are these newsreels of hundreds and hundreds of little skinny boys flailing around with oversized boxing gloves trying to hit each other. And boxing and soccer were the 2 most popular sports in Europe, especially Germany, during the 1930s. And Max Schmeling became the heavyweight boxing champion of Germany and then of Europe. Now, Max Schmeling did not like the Nazis, and yet the Nazis portrayed him as pro-Nazi. He had a Jewish manager named Joe Jacobs, and when Hitler demanded that Schmeling fire his Jewish manager, Schmeling had the guts to say no to Hitler, which was extraordinary. He refused to fire him. And Hitler didn't do anything about it because he so admired Schmeling. On another occasion, Joseph Goebbels sent Schmeling to the Vatican as an emissary for the Nazis and tried to get the Pope to say that he was praying for a Nazi victory. And the Pope said that what he was praying for was peace in Europe. And when Schmeling came back and told this to the Nazis, they were furious, and Goebbels wanted to have him tried as a traitor. And it was just insane. And during Kristallnacht, Max Schmeling hid a couple of Jewish teenagers in his hotel room in Berlin and called down to the desk and said, if anyone calls me, just say that I'm sick and you can't reach me. And he put himself in a very vulnerable position of being treated as a traitor and taken out and shot in an effort to protect Jews. But during the 1930s, especially in America, he was portrayed as a Nazi stooge, and he was anything but a Nazi stooge. He did everything that he possibly could to undermine the Nazis without putting himself at terrible personal risk.
Okay. Now, we were talking about in the 20s and the 30s, prior to or just as the Nazis were coming into power, when they were coming into power, but really before World War II, that there was, a significant amount of Jewish boxers. So could you talk a little bit about that, how many there were, or approximately? I think also perhaps there were some Jewish boxing clubs specifically. I know that there was that Club Maccabee, which I'm assuming was a Jewish boxing club.
Right, there were Maccabee clubs all over Europe. They were in Greece, they were in Tunisia, they were in Germany before the Nazis came to power. And they also tended to be pro-Zionist clubs, in that part of the mission of them was not only to help Jewish young men learn to defend themselves through boxing, but it was also to argue for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so most of these early Jewish boxers were also Zionists, and it was very important to them. And there were a lot of Jewish boxers in Europe, and an enormous number in America. There were over 200 Jewish boxers in America from 1910 to 1941. In fact, they dominated the sport for those 30 years. And there were about 24 Jewish world champions in every weight division that you could think of. The only heavyweight one was Max Baer, who wasn't completely Jewish. He was partially Jewish, but he identified with Jews, and throughout his career, he wore a Jewish star on his trunks.
Right. So with a number of very successful or Jewish boxers in Germany, before the Nazis really came into power or took over, the Olympics, so the Berlin Olympics, talk a little bit about that, because they were not allowed to fight.
They were not allowed to fight. There were no Jews permitted to participate on behalf of the Nazis. And even the American Avery Brundage kept Jewish athletes from participating because he didn't want to offend the Nazis,
Right.
which was terrible. And there was one a German woman who was very Aryan looking, who was a European fencing champion. And to prove to the world that they weren't anti-Semitic, they permitted this woman to be a fencer for the Nazi fencing team, but no one could mention that she was Jewish, which was the craziness of this. We have a Jewish fencer, but you can't mention that she's Jewish. And she said the only reason that she agreed to participate is to protect Jewish relatives she had, because she thought it would help them from being sent to concentration camps.
Now, I believe it's correct that prior to those Olympics, sort of all of the anti-Semitic violence and acts were told to kind of calm down so that no one would see all the people coming to Berlin for the Olympics. They wouldn't see everything, all the horrors that were going on. Is that correct?
Exactly. They completely camouflaged all the anti-Semitism and camouflaged the anti-Semitic laws, the Nuremberg laws that were propagated throughout Germany.
Now, in addition to not being able to box in the Olympics, weren't the Jewish fighters all stripped of all of their titles and any recognition or awards they had received, or any kind of notice of that at all?
Yeah, once the Nazis came into power, it was considered verboten to have Jews perceived as champions, because it would reflect negatively on the Aryan Superman. So a lot of Jews who had attained important championship titles for the record book, those titles were eliminated for German consumption anyway.
So going into the book, I thought you did an awesome profile of each one of the 5 fighters, really from their how they became successful fighters, from children, and how they got into fighting. And so maybe you could take each one of them and kind of do a little bit deeper dive on each one of the boxers and their story, and some lived and some didn't live.
Right. Well, the first one that I profiled was a man named Victor Perez, who was known as Young Perez. He came from Tunis, and he learned to fight as a teenager. He and his older brother, who was known as Kid Perez, and he became the youngest featherweight boxing champion in Europe at age 19. And he became a celebrity, a major celebrity in France. And he had an affair with a woman, Muriel Ballin, who was a leading French movie star at the time. And they were photographed all over Paris, on the Champs-Élysées, going into stores, going to theaters, going into nightclubs. And he got so caught up in the party life of Paris that he began to lead a very dissipated life, and began to lose his boxing skills because of it. And so he lost a number of fights thereafter, and was also in the process of trying to make a number of comebacks. But all during this time, at this time, the Nazis came and conquered France. And his lover, this famous French movie actress, decided that her future lay with the Nazis since they were the conquerors. And she had an affair with an SS officer named Burl Desbach. And she betrayed Victor Perez to the Nazis. And his brother had wanted him to come back to Tunis because he said you would be safer in Tunis than in Paris. And Victor thought that because of his celebrity would protect him, and it didn't. The Nazis came and arrested him, and he was sent to a subcamp of Auschwitz called Monowitz, where he was forced into doing terrible labor work. And they soon discovered that he was a boxer, and he was forced to fight an SS guard who was enormous, much larger than he was, and he was getting beaten to a pulp. And the Jews were invited to watch this fight, but they had to keep their heads down, and they weren't permitted to say anything. But they began whispering to themselves his nickname, which was Young, and they kept saying, Young, 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 and it became like a chant, and it inspired him. And Victor all of a sudden sprung into action and was able to pummel this SS guard who's about 100 pounds heavier than he was. And the Nazis were appalled that this happened. But also as a result of that, they forced him to continue fighting. And he had one fight after another, many of them. And then during the death marches, when Auschwitz was being liberated, and the Nazis wanted to cover up their crimes, they had marches of the inmates out of the camps back into Germany. And Perez saw a stale loaf of bread off to the side of the road, and he went to get it to feed himself and several of his colleagues. And a Nazi SS guard saw him and shot him twice in the head and killed him. And he was just 33 years old, and that was the end of his life, and the end of a brilliant career. His mistress, she escaped from Germany. She went to Italy. She and her Nazi boyfriend were discovered by the Free French. They executed her boyfriend, and she was taken back to France, and she was tried. And she had a terrible life after that. She appeared in 1 or 2 movies that weren't very successful, and she died a distraught woman in poverty. She became the shame of France.
She was also, wasn't she raped in prison too?
Yeah, she was raped several times in prison and beaten up and treated. I mean, she was really a hated person after the French gained their freedom from the Nazis.
Right. Of course, one thing in reading the book, besides the atrocities that were, the inmates of the concentration camps had to endure, starvation, disease, beatings. I didn't realize this, that a lot of the women too were repeatedly gang raped too in the concentration camps. And if they got pregnant, they were shot right away, right?
That's right. Yeah, and if a baby perhaps was born, the baby was instantly killed, and then the mother was killed as well. It was horrendous. It was just unbelievable.
All right. So the next fighter.
The next fighter is a man named Nathan Shapow, who grew up in Riga, Latvia. He was a natural athlete. He was strong. He participated in a number of sports, and he, like Perez, trained at a Maccabi club in Riga. And when first the Soviets had conquered it, and they treated the Jews pretty badly, but then the Nazis came in and they treated the Jews really badly.
Right.
They They took 25,000 Jews of Riga and they killed them in the Rumbala forest. It was next to Babi Yar, the second greatest massacre of Jews in World War II. And there was a hated SS man, his last name was Hoffman, who was pursuing Schapau because he hated the fact that Schapau was so strong and seemed to carry himself with defiance and courage. And he followed Schapau into his home one day, and he was going to kill Schapau. And he pushed Schapau against the wall. And then as Schapau was turning around, he saw Hoffman pull a German Luger out of his holster. And before he could fire it, Schapau belted him in the face and knocked him unconscious.
Right.
But rather than taking the gun and killing Hoffman, which he thought would attract attention, he took a lamp or a club and he beat Hoffman to death. And then he covered the body and he dragged it out to a place where he thought it would be hidden. But the next morning, two SS men found the body, and they gathered all the Jews into the center of Riga, and they said, "We want a confession, and if there's no confession about who killed Hoffman, we're going to execute two innocent men at random." And this put Schapau in a terrible position. If he confesses, he's going to be killed. If he doesn't confess, two innocent men are going to be killed. He didn't confess, and two innocent men were strung up and killed in the town square. He was eventually arrested with everyone else in Riga, and he was sent to a place called the Kaiserwald, a concentration camp, where he was forced to do hard labor. And at that camp, he was also forced to fight, and he beat a former middleweight boxing champion named Werner Samuel, and that got him in more trouble because now he had to keep fighting to save himself. Eventually, he was transported to another camp called the Stutthof concentration camp. And there, when the Jews used to arrive by train, the guards used to sing the following ugly song as the Jews would being forced off the train. They used to say, "Jews go through the Red Sea, the waves close in, and the world is happy. Jews are drowned." It was horrible. From there, he was shipped to the Magdeburg camp. And when that camp was being, before liberated in a death camp, the guards forced the 50,000 Jews into the water around the camp, and they couldn't fit them on boats to evacuate them. So the machine gunned all 50,000 of these Jews in the water. But when this was going on, Schapau managed to escape with several other men from the camp. And in the process of escaping, they also encountered an SS guard whom they killed. And Schapau took part of the SS man's uniform, and the other people took other parts of the uniform. And when they encountered Allied troops, he had to prove that he wasn't an SS guard.
Right.
And he met an American soldier who spoke Yiddish, and he was able to convince him that he wasn't an SS guard. He had a couple of fights that the Allies wanted in displaced persons camps, and then he went off to Palestine. And in Palestine, he came across a con artist who had stolen his family's money when they were trying to escape from Riga, his mother and his brother. And he encountered this man, and he nearly beat him to death in Jerusalem. There he joined the Irgun and fought for Israeli independence, and then joined the IDF. He'd met his wife there. They got married. They moved to Chicago, and then they moved to Los Angeles, where he raised a son and daughter and opened a successful trucking company.
But just from what I remember in the book, he was pretty severely affected with PSTD and, had a lot of fits of anger, which I don't think.
No, that was primarily Harry Haft.
Oh, Harry Haft, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. What was interesting about Nathan Chapow, and I contrast him with Harry Haft, is that Nathan Chapow was so happy to be alive, so happy to smell fresh air, to see the sunshine,
Right.
and to be in America, that he just loved life. He just figured that he was the luckiest man on earth to have survived all of this. And he imparted that to his children as well.
Right. Right. Yes. No, I was getting him confused with Harry Haft, but the survivor's guilt was not uncommon amongst.
No, he did have survivor's guilt. There's no question about it. Not only, from the fights that he had where the opponents were dragged off and killed, but also to that event in Riga where 2 innocent men were hanged.
That's right. So, I mean, that's the thing too, is it was kill, or it was fight and survive, or lose a fight and be killed, or starve to death, or shot. So the winners of the fight, got bloodied and bruised. The losers were hauled off, shot, killed, starved. So
exactly. And if you refused to fight, you were killed.
Right.
So they really, I mean, it was a terrible choice these men had to make.
Right. Okay, the next one.
The next one was the Greek middleweight champion. He became the champion at age 17. His name was Salamo Aruch, and he was from Salonika, which had the largest Jewish population of any city in Greece. And it was known because of that as the mother of Israel. And the Nazis sent a terrible person there named Alois Bruna to round up the Jews and to send them to concentration camps. Incidentally, after the war, Bruna escaped. He was a Nazi war criminal. He escaped to Syria, where he trained the Syrian army on how to torture captured Israeli soldiers. He was a monster. And on March 15th, 1943, Aruch, his father, mother, sisters, and brother were all taken to Auschwitz, and they were all killed. But boxing kept Salamo alive. He beat an enormous Czech fighter, and therefore he was given special treatment, a minimal amount of nourishment just to keep him alive. And he fought a man named Klaus Silber, who was everyone thought he was going to win because he was such a terrific fighter, Klaus Silber, and Salamo beat him so badly that after the fight, Silber was dragged off, and no one ever heard of him again. Right. It was said that he was probably killed as a result of that, and he was scheduled to fight. Salamo was scheduled to fight his boyhood friend, who had also trained in the Maccabee club with him, a man named Jacko Razan, who had a terrific career. He had won 120 straight fights. And just before these two were to fight one another, the Allies freed the camp. And so they avoided having to fight with one another, which was a blessing for both of them. He went to Palestine also. He joined the IDF and fought not only in the 1948 War of Liberation, but also in the Six-Day War in 1967. And he died of a stroke in Israel in 2009.
One thing I wanted to ask you, going back to the boxing clubs, Maccabee, why were they created? Was there an issue with Jewish boxers being able to box, I mean, before the Nazis, in regular clubs? Why were Jewish clubs formed? I mean, just like Jewish
the regular clubs weren't Zionist clubs, and Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, basically believed that Jews should be empowered, and yes, they could learn to fight in non-Jewish clubs, but they would not be learning to fight as Jewish Zionists. They would be
Okay.
learning to fight as boxers.
Got it.
And so this was an entirely different attitude,
Got it.
and gave them a sense of nationalist purpose, which they wouldn't have gotten in a regular boxing club.
Okay. But the regular boxing clubs were not restrictive in
Not in the 1920s, and not until
Sure.
the Nuremberg laws.
Of course.
It was after that the Jews were expelled
Sure.
from just about everything.
Everything. Okay, the fourth boxer.
The fourth one was a gypsy or a Sinti boxer who his name was Johann Trollman, and his father had sent him to a boxing club to learn to box because he was bullied as a child. He didn't look like an Aryan. He had curly black hair. It was long. He was swarthy in appearance, and because he was a gypsy, gypsies had a very bad reputation in Germany, even before the Nazis came to power. They were looked upon as vagabonds, as thieves, as con artists, and so forth. And so it was very difficult for them to gain any kind of footing of respectability in Germany. And he, oddly enough, was trained by the most prominent Jewish German boxer in the 1920s, a man named Erich Seelig. And both of these men had been denied the opportunity to participate in the 1928 Olympics before the Nazis came to power. One because he was Jewish, the other because he was a gypsy. Now, Johann was a very creative boxer. The style of boxing in Germany in the 1930s was to stand in the center of the ring and to trade punches with your opponent. It was a very kind of flat-footed style of boxing. If you're familiar at all with boxing, if you think of someone like Sugar Ray Robinson or Muhammad Ali, they danced around the ring. They were hard to hit.
The duck and weave. The
duck and weave, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, that kind of thing. And that's how Johann fought. And it was considered very un-Germanic and not fair to the Germans. And he beat a German boxer named Adolf Witt for the light heavyweight title. And the next day, the German Boxing Commission, which was run by Nazis, took away his title. And there was a big argument about this, that this wasn't fair and that it should be reinstated. So they reinstated it, and then they denied him again. And he was permitted to fight this guy again, but he was told that if he had any fancy footwork again, he would immediately be disqualified and probably dragged off to a concentration camp. So as a parody, this guy had also a sense of humor. He dyed his hair blonde, and he covered his body with white baking powder, and he entered the ring like a parody of an Aryan. And oddly enough, the Nazis in the audience were even laughing at this. And he fought as they wanted him to fight, and he did pretty well. He really won the fight, but he lost the decision because he wasn't a Nazi. Anyway, after that, which is very strange, the Wehrmacht drafted him and sent him to the Eastern Front to fight. He was wounded and then sent back home to recover from his wounds. But because he was a Sinti, they said that he was no longer a use to the Wehrmacht, and he was dishonorably discharged from the army. And because he was dishonorably discharged and he was a Sinti, they sent him to Auschwitz, where he was very badly beaten by a number of guards. And there were people in the camp who befriended him, and they knew that he was going to get killed. And so they faked his death. They took someone who had been died, and they gave Johann his name and identity, and they took the person who had died, and they gave that person Johann's identity. And so that person was buried in a shroud in the camp. And then the Nazis were so pecuniary that they then sent Johann's family a bill for his burial service in the concentration camp. And from there, his friends who had saved his life had him sent to the Wittenberg camp. But there he was recognized by a capo named Emil Cornelius and forced to fight him. And this Emil Cornelius was a terrible sadist who would beat people just for the fun of beating them. And Trollman outboxed him and beat him, even though Cornelius was many times larger. And Cornelius was maybe 100 pounds and skeletal at that time. Well, Cornelius was so angry and humiliated by this experience that he loaded him down with a terrible workload that was almost designed to kill him. But that wasn't enough for Cornelius. He came up behind Trollman one day and beat him to death with a club. And that was the end of Trollman. It was terrible what happened to him. The other boxer we spoke about was Harry Haft, who had a terrible time. Even as a young man, I think he was 16 or 17, he was taken by a Nazi and questioned, and the Nazi didn't like his attitude and put his hand in a door jamb and slammed the door in his hand and broke all the fingers in his hand. They broke like pretzels. And he was sent to Auschwitz, and his job was throwing gassed bodies into the ovens. He and another man, that was their job, to take the bodies from the gas chambers and throw them into the ovens to be incinerated. A terrible thing happened to him, which in addition to everything else, which caused further trauma to him, one of the men that he threw into the oven, he saw his eyes were still open and he was alive. And he had no choice but to throw this guy into the oven. 5 or 10 minutes later, he got to throw the man's dead wife into the oven. And this was just a terrible experience. But he was told that if he wanted to spare himself, he had to box, and he had the bare knuckle boxing. There were no gloves to protect their hands or anything. And the SS assembled a group of it's crazy, a group of Jewish musicians around a boxing museum, a ring rather, to play violins as a musical accompaniment to what was going on in the boxing ring. And he was forced to box 6 men in one night. Boxing one man, if you're in terrific physical condition and you've been training and so forth, is an exhausting experience. To fight 6 men when you can barely stand up, it brings you just near death. But he was a very determined man, and he and somebody else, they managed to escape. And in the process of escaping, they were able to shoot an SS guard shot at them, and they fell into a ditch, and a dead friend fell on top of Harry Haft, and 2 guards went to the ditch, and one of them was about to fire bullets in to make sure they were both dead, and the other guard said, "Don't waste your ammunition, they're both dead." And that saved Harry Haft. He was alive. And then he continued on his own, and he spotted another SS guard bathing in a river, and he picked up the man's gun and clothing, and as the man came out of the river to confront him, Harry Haft shot and killed him, and then took the butt of the gun and bashed his head in. And he dressed in the man's uniform, and he too, when he was captured in an SS uniform by Allied troops, had to convince them that he wasn't a Wehrmacht. He had to convince them that he was Jewish. And he was placed in a DP camp, and then after the war and after being released from the DP camp, he sailed to New York, and he had no skills because he had been a captive since the age of 16. And he came here, and he had a number of amateur and then pro boxing matches. And he had a manager who was not the most sophisticated boxing manager in the world, and eventually set him up to fight a man who would go on to become the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Rocky Marciano. And this, I think, was in 1949. And it was at a boxing arena in Westchester County. And just before the fight, some mafia guys came into the dressing room, and they told him that if he didn't lose the fight, he would be killed. And he knew they were serious because they had killed another boxer a few weeks before who had refused to do that. But he didn't lay down in the first round, which is what if they wanted him to do. He did get knocked out in the third round, and he claimed that he let himself be knocked out so that nothing bad would happen to him. But this absolutely infuriated him. A man who had 76 fights in Auschwitz, escaped, was almost killed during the escape, and his career is ended by the mafia, the only career that he had, the only thing he knew how to do. And had to, eventually he opened a fruit and vegetable store in Brooklyn, and he was a terrible father. He was mean-spirited, quick-tempered, and mean to his two sons. And it wasn't until his son, Alan Haft, realized why his father was this way, that he finally came to forgive his father and to hope that his father would forgive him. And if you don't mind, I just want to read a letter that he wrote to his father at the end to show his father how much he cared about him. And this is a letter that Alan sent to me, and he said I could quote it in the book. He writes, "Dear Popsy, you've been gone nearly 12 years. I miss not having a father. Growing up, you beat me for my childish misbehavior. The rage you had inside, you often took out on me. I feared your very presence. You broke furniture and punched out windows, abused Mom to no end. Despite the abuse, Mom always protected you, excused your behavior because of your background. I could not excuse you until I learned what that background was. I was ashamed of you. You could not read or write. You spoke broken English with a thick accent and had those green numbers on your arm. I wish I knew then what I know now. You suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. You saw horror, were forced to participate in it. After you told me about all your ordeal, what you had to do just to live another day, it helped me to understand why you were who you were and are who you are. I now see how sorry you are for the abuse. How can anyone judge you? They call you a Holocaust survivor, but does anyone really survive? It has been said that the Nazi murdered your soul. Popsy, I have spent my later years trying to make the world better for you. Your story was published by Syracuse University. You were inducted into the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. There is a major motion picture about your life. I know that you would have been happy that I made you famous. Despite the physical and psychological abuse, I would want you to know I forgive you. Mom died this summer. She was the angel sent by God to care for you. Now it's your turn to take care of her. Love, Alan."
Yes, it was really just all of these fighters, all the people in the camps, what horrible things they went through. As you mentioned, they were forced to box fight after fight. In many cases, when they weren't boxing other inmates, if they were boxing the guards were well fed and well rested and a foot taller, 100 pounds heavier. I mean, it's not like the boxers, the inmates were in peak condition. They were starved. They were, I think Nathan Chappell had, come in at 200 pounds. He was down to 105 pounds. They were
Right.
near death, and they were forced to do this really to save their lives. So
Exactly.
So I know we're coming to the Q&A time. I mean, the after the details of the different fighters, there's some fascinating chapters on the post-war avenging movement and how retribution was made against the Nazi war criminals, either at the higher echelons of the Third Reich or just even the Gestapo guards. So there's a fascinating chapters on that. Then interestingly enough, after all of this, boxing in Germany sort of declined in popularity and really never came back to the esteemed glory that it was. And then, finally talking about anti-Semitism in the US and Europe, and really how before the war, maybe this could have all been avoided, but people kind of looked the other way, and whether they didn't want to, they thought by looking the other way, Hitler wouldn't bother people, or it just, they didn't want to admit it. But as we say, never again.
Right.
So I think it's important, to keep remembering these things. There's obviously been a lot of publications on the Holocaust, but, as someone who is Jewish, I felt it really fascinating to read the detailed stories. I knew nothing about boxing being so popular amongst Jewish people, and how popular the Jewish boxers were in the US and in Europe and in Germany. And just to have the personal stories of these five individuals, just really made it such a personal experience. And the book is amazing. Again, I want to, for anyone, please, I think we've put out where you can get a hold of the book, Holocaust Fighters. I bought the book because I'm actually going to ask Jeffrey to autograph this for my dad, who's in Florida. But I also read it on my, online, and it's a really awesome read and a very quick read. So I encourage everyone to read it.
Thank you.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you for your time. So now, do we, David, open up to Q&A then? Can we open that up?
Yes, you just have to press on the Q&A button.
Okay, well, I see. Okay, Sarah. Hello, Sarah. What is the history perhaps of boxing and Krav Maga, the current military self-defense system?
Well, those people know how to box as well. And there are two Russian Jewish American boxers now who also have mastered that technique. One of them is named Dmitry Salita, and the other one is named Yuri Foreman. And Yuri Foreman is not only a champion boxer, he's an Orthodox rabbi, which is an interesting combination. But the Israeli Defense Forces have used boxing along with their own technique, which you mentioned, as part of its self-defense training.
Okay. Since we have a few minutes, maybe we can go back and talk a little bit about anti-Semitism before World War II in the US and Europe, and even what your thoughts are today, what's going on.
Well, in my first boxing book, Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, I have several chapters in there about anti-Semitism in America and how prominent it was, especially in the 1930s, probably the most anti-Semitic decade in American history. And it started with Henry Ford, who had a publication called the Dearborn Independent, which was written explicitly to condemn Jews in sports. And a lot of people don't know this, but Henry Ford was the only American praised and mentioned in Mein Kampf. And while Mein Kampf was required reading for every high school student in Germany, the second most popular book was a 2-volume bound version of the Dearborn Independent, Henry Ford's publication. And that was finally ceased by a Jewish labor lawyer who sued him, and because the Ford Motor Company was so upset about the possibility of sales of Ford motor vehicles being affected by this, that they ceased the publication and they forced Henry Ford to issue an apology, saying that what he said about Jews wasn't true. But he personally never said it. He had his lawyer write a document and submit it to the public. But the other two people who viciously disseminated anti-Semitism and Henry Ford said the problem with baseball in America is that there were too many Jews playing baseball, and they should be taken out of the baseball game. And the other two members, very prominent members of society, who said terrible things about Jews. One was the nationally renowned aviator Charles Lindbergh, who was a friend of the Nazis, received an award from Hermann Goering for praising the Luftwaffe. And when World War II broke out, he wanted a commission in the United States Air Force, and Franklin Roosevelt refused to give it to him. I have a quote from Roosevelt saying, "It seems like Lindbergh is modeling himself on Joseph Goebbels. What happened to this supposedly all-American boy? He's not." And the other one was a Catholic priest named Charles Coughlin, who was a vicious anti-Semite, who had one of the most popular radio shows in the United States during the 1930s. And he used to refer to Roosevelt as Rosenfeld, and as a friend of the Jews, and complaining about the Jews in government, and saying that the Jews were the ones who wanted war with Germany, and this would come back to haunt the Jews. And Lindbergh said the same thing, of course. And it wasn't until the Catholic Church in New York forced Charles Coughlin off the air as America was getting ready for war, and that ended his career. But and then you had the German American Bund, which was a pro-Nazi movement with hundreds of thousands of members throughout the United States. I mentioned that when my father went to see Max Baer fight Max Schmeling in Yankee Stadium in 1933, while half of the 60,000 fans were Jewish and stood up to cheer for Max Baer, there were thousands and thousands of German American Bund people in the stadium waving Nazi flags and cheering on Max Schmeling. So it was a terrible time in America, and it was mirrored by exactly what was going on in Germany, except we didn't have the same kind of horrible laws like the Nuremberg laws that they had in Germany, which were really deeply oppressive to all Jews in Germany.
And also, you know, the whole all of the folks who were considered subhuman. So obviously the Jewish population, but the Gypsies, Catholics, homosexuals,
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witness, right?
I mean, and what was interesting is they all had to wear different symbols in the constant. You know, the homosexuals had to wear a pink triangle. The Gypsies had to wear a brown triangle. The Jehovah's Witnesses had another color. I mean, it was, someone called it color-coded discrimination.
Right. Well, you know, as we said, never forget is the story. I don't think we have any other questions from the audience, but, you know, just a fascinating read. I encourage everyone to please just read this book. It's just a fascinating story of a very, very challenging time in the world. Jeffrey, want to thank you for making time tonight to speak with everyone. It's been great to get to know you. Enjoyed the book, so thank you.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Stay safe and have a great evening. Thank you very much.